is KevinLeyton-Brown, and associate professor here in computer science. He graduated from McMaster in 1998 and went to Stanford, where he did his master's and PhD, finishing in 2003 and came here. We're very lucky to have him. His work is at the intersection of computer science and economics, and he's studying computational problems in economic context and incentive issues in multi-agent systems. He's also, with his colleagues here, studied the application of machine learning to the automated design and analysis of algorithms for hard computational problems. In fact, let's test that. He's written two books, co-authored in game theory and multi-agent systems. He's got lots of publications. He's done a lot of work in the community in terms of chairing important conferences and winning best paper awards and medals for the Satzilla. Satzilla award was quite famous. And he's also served as consultant for several companies, quite in demand. And one of the most interesting things that Kevin has done recently is complete the first BBC move with Coursera on game theory. So I'll just hand it over to Kevin and talk about games, markets, and algorithms.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks a lot. Let's make sure you can hear me. Let me invite people who are at the back and standing around to come either sort of slip in the sides or sit at the front. There still are chairs here, and maybe if you just want to take a second to come have a comfortable seat, don't be shy. If cookies are more important to you, I understand that. So I'm going to talk today about work that's kind of at the intersection between microeconomics and computer science. This area goes under the name of algorithmic game theory. This is really kind of a name that's given to this interface between the two disciplines. I think it's defined by the characteristic that we're looking at problems, both computational and incentive problems, that come about when multiple self-interested agents interact with each other. So I'm particularly interested in thinking about systems in which multiple distinct people participate and in which those people's interests need to be reasoned about. The reason that this is its own field rather than being a sub-area of computer science or a sub-area of economics is that it's really necessary to think carefully about constraints that come from both of these disciplines. From game theory or microeconomics, the really important constraint that we bring on board is that the people using these systems are self-interested. And so we can't simply build a system and tell people how they ought to use it, but rather we build a system and then people use it however it is that they choose to use it, and we have to live with the consequences. And the constraints we take from computer science are, in a sense, the constraints we always have in computer science, which is resource constraints. There's never enough time, storage, or bandwidth to accomplish whatever we want to accomplish, and so we have to think carefully about how to make good use of the resources we do have. Algorithmic game theory is built on top of game theory, so I should say a little bit about quite what game theory is. I would call game theory the mathematical study of interaction between multiple agents who are self-interested and rational. And both of these terms, self-interested and rational, are in a sense technical terms. By self-interested, what I mean is that agents have their own utilities. So not necessarily that agents want what's good for them to the exclusion of what's good for everybody else, but rather that everybody has their own description of how they feel about things that might happen in the world, that they kind of carry around with them, that they don't need to know anything more than that to know how they feel about outcomes in the world. And by rational, I mean that people's way of making decisions in the world is to try to maximize that utility, to try to act in such a way as to bring about good outcomes from their point of view. Formally speaking, a game is defined by three things: a set of players or agents, I'll use those terms interchangeably, a set of actions, which is the things that those players might do in the interaction that they're having with each other, and a utility function or a payoff function that describes how the different players feel about all of the different things that might happen in the game. And there are many different questions that game theorists ask, but at a very high level, most of these questions can be understood as falling within a couple of different camps. So one thing we might want to know is, given a description of a game, how we would expect people to behave in that game. Secondly, we might have sort of a schema for a game in which there's some kind of knob that we can control. There's some sort of design dimension that we as a system designer have in structuring an interaction between people who nevertheless have their own interests. And we might ask, how can I structure those interactions in a way that yields behavior that I as a system designer think is desirable somehow? As Alan mentioned, I've just finished teaching a course on Coursera, this massive open online course on game theory. And so this lecture certainly won't cover the same material as the course, but I hope by the end of this lecture you'll have some sense of why this is something of broad interest to both computer scientists and economists, and why so many people have decided that this is an exciting thing to know about. I'm, broadly speaking, going to talk about 3 different topics today. The first is reasoning about large games. So I've told you what a game is, and now I'm going to try to think about how we can use particularly computational ideas to reason about really large-scale interactions between multiple individuals. So how many of you have seen a pop-up like this when you were surfing the internet? And how many of you have clicked on one? All right, so this is clearly a sophisticated computer science audience. Surprisingly enough, I didn't click on this one either, so I can't be sure, but at least tools like this exist that really do make your internet connection faster for you, or at least can. And I want to give you an example of how such a thing can work to illustrate a key game theoretic idea. So it turns out that in the TCP protocol, there's something called a back-off mechanism. And the way that it works is that when routers on the internet are getting congested, they simply throw away some of the packets that they receive. And because these packets get thrown away, eventually acknowledgement packets don't come back. And so the sender realizes that their packets didn't get through and they need to resend. However, they don't just resend, they also make an adjustment to the rate at which they send packets. So if packets are going missing, then they slow down the rate. That's called backing off. And if all the packets are getting through, then they increase it back up. And this is essentially why, sort of how congestion control happens, at least through TCP on the internet. And it sort of explains why the network is not sort of flooded all the time. However, you can think about different users on the internet as essentially being agents in a game. And each of them faces the question of whether they think this back-off mechanism is good for them. So if you actually downloaded this tool that's being advertised in the pop-up that you just saw, what it does is it goes in to the TCP implementation on your computer and just turns off the back-off mechanism. And what that means is you act as though the internet is uncongested all the time. You just blast the internet with all the packets that it makes you happy to send, regardless of how many are going missing. You consume a larger fraction of the packets at a given router, and you get better throughput as a result. So if we want to reason about whether this is a good idea for you to do, we might model this situation as a game. I'm going to model it here as a 2-player game, but this limitation to 2 players isn't particularly important. It scales up to larger games. So I need to put some numbers to it if I want to call it a game. So I'll say that if both players use a correct implementation of TCP that really does back off, then let's say they both get a 1 millisecond delay. If one uses a correct implementation and the other hacks TCP, then the person who hacked gets considerably better performance. Let's say they have a negligible delay. Whereas the person with the defective implementation now experiences a much greater delay because they have a small proportion of the packets at a given router. On the other hand, there's a reason why the people who wrote TCP didn't actually do it this way. If everybody was to do this, then the network just gets flooded. It gets hard to get packets all the way through from source to destination, and everyone is worse off. And so let's say if both people use the defective implementation, we end up with a delay of 3 milliseconds for both people. So I can write this as a game matrix, as you see here. This is sort of the canonical way of writing down games like this. It's called the normal form of a game. And it turns out this game is an example of probably the most famous game in game theory, which is called the prisoner's dilemma. It's famous in part because it describes a wide variety of situations like this one. And there's something interesting about the prisoner's dilemma, which is, in a sense, it's very easy to decide what you should do, at least if you're going to play the prisoner's dilemma only once, the way I'm sort of caricaturing it here. And so in this unrepeated version of the prisoner's dilemma, both players have what is called the dominant strategy. And that is to use the defective implementation. So let me argue that to you. Let's say I'm player 1, and I want to reason about what player 2 might do and what I should do in response. So I might say, well, if player 2 was to play C, if player 2 was to use the correct implementation, then I have a choice between a delay of 1 and a delay of 0. And a delay of 0 is better for me than a delay of 1, so I should use the defective implementation in that case. On the other hand, if player 2 was to play D, then I have a choice between a delay of 3 and a delay of 4. That's not as good for me as the case that I was in before, but what remains true is that the right thing for me to do is the same. It's still better for me to play D than it is to play C. And that means my best response doesn't differ when I change the other person's action. I have a single thing that really is kind of the right thing for me to do. And so the dilemma of prisoner's dilemma is that would result in both players ending up in this outcome over here, which seems much worse to us than this outcome over here. It's worse for everybody. And so that kind of seems like a problem. There's a lot of literature on how we can think about that problem. But I just want to leave you with this idea of analyzing a game and what a dominant strategy means. Now, of course, not all games are so easy to analyze. So to take another game that it would be familiar to you, rock, paper, scissors is a game in which you don't have a dominant strategy. The right thing for you to do in rock, paper, scissors depends on what the other person is doing. So your best response to the other player's action is different for every action that the other player would take. And the same is true for more interesting games like poker, for example. So you might wonder then, what can we say about games like this? Well, the key insight for which John Nash was rewarded by being the subject of a movie about his mental illness and played by Russell Crowe, and incidentally by the Nobel Prize in Economics, was the idea of a Nash equilibrium. And what John Nash said was, let's not think just about single players' actions and about best responses. Let's think collectively about what everybody does all at the same time. And let's try to find things that everybody could do where everybody is simultaneously best responding to each other. Everybody is kind of, in a sense, in balance or in equilibrium with each other, in the sense that if I knew what everyone else was doing, I would keep doing the thing that I'm doing. So such a strategy profile is called a Nash equilibrium. And Nash's really kind of key result is that at least one Nash equilibrium exists in every game. That's kind of a deep result, because it doesn't depend on how many players there are, how many actions each player has, or what the utility numbers are. Absolutely regardless of how you write down a game, you give me a game, I'll give you back a Nash equilibrium, as long as players are allowed to randomize. Now, if you're a computer scientist and you hear someone say something like, you give me this and I'll give you back that, this sounds like a computational problem. And so a natural thing that computer scientists have wondered about is actually the problem of finding a Nash equilibrium. It turns out that Nash's theorem is non-constructive. It proceeds by fixed point arguments. And so we can't really directly use the argument that he used as a way of finding an equilibrium. Because we're searching a continuous space, it's a pretty tricky problem. The best known algorithms for finding a Nash equilibrium require exponential time. It's actually been a really hot problem in complexity theory over the past few decades to figure out the complexity of finding a Nash equilibrium. Because the problem is in NP, I know that I can, if you show me an equilibrium, I can quickly check that it's an equilibrium. But it doesn't seem like this problem would be complete for a class like NP, because unlike other NP-complete problems, here I know the answer is always yes. Right? I know there's an equilibrium, I just don't know how to find it. So this is a computational problem of the type, here's a thing that I know exists, find me one as fast as you can. It turned out, in the end, if you're curious, that this problem is complete for a class called PPAD. It's still not known whether PPAD is as hard as NP or not, but this is believed to be a negative result. So it's believed that unless the complexity hierarchy collapses in some pretty profound ways, that the exponential time may be the most that we can hope for finding a Nash equilibrium in the worst case. Well, so turns out game theory, for the most part, hasn't worried too much about this problem of computing equilibria, in part because the analysis of very simple games has turned out to be surprisingly effective. And we really learned a lot by thinking about games like The Prisoner's Dilemma and all kinds of other sort of canonical 2x2 games. They've impacted not just the way we think about things like nuclear deterrence and strategic situations, but even popular culture. So if you're curious, I invite you after the talk to Google Dark Knight or Strangelove game theory and find out how deeply these movies were actually influenced by ideas from game theory. But as much fun as it is to make it into Batman, we really would still like to use game theory to think about the real world, to think about real systems. And real systems do involve a lot more than just two agents and two actions. So for example, I would like to be able to use game theory to think about questions like, how will users with different demands on a network choose to route their traffic? Or how will advertisers bid in a sponsored search auction, like the ones that Google runs? Or in a job market, how will people with different aptitudes choose which skills to pursue? Or in a city, how will businesses choose to locate, taking into account the inherent value of different places they may locate and the competition they face from other businesses? Turns out that these kinds of questions are difficult to ask using the sorts of tools that game theorists typically use, because game theory, for the most part, proceeds analytically. So the typical thing that a game theorist would do is to write down a bunch of equations that characterize a game, do a bunch of very impressive math, and in the end draw some kind of conclusion about what must be true in this game. That's a powerful technique. It's yielded most of what we know about game theory, but there are limitations to how complex a setting you can think about that way. We sort of hit this sort of boundary of what can be tackled analytically. Instead, I'm really interested in developing complementary approaches that reason computationally about well-defined settings and are able to give us answers back that are as game theoretically rigorous as the ones we get analytically, but which are derived computationally. So I came to be asking myself, what's holding us back from actually doing this? And I think a big part of the answer is a question of representation. So that 2x2 matrix that I put up for you before was sort of beguilingly simple. But if you think about what it represents, I had one dimension in the table for every player, and I had one entry along every dimension for every action. So if you think about a game with 20 players in it, to write that down, I would have a 20-dimensional table. That quickly becomes impractical. Not only that, but when I said that the worst case performance for finding something like a Nash equilibrium is exponential, of course I meant exponential in the size of its input, as we always do in complexity theory. And what that means is that it's actually doubly exponential in the number of players. So pretty simple games become pretty unreasonable to reason about computationally. This leads to the idea for a research program that would try to advance this computational program by, first of all, trying to find representations that can describe games that we're interested in more compactly, using exponentially less space than the normal form. And at this point, you might think to yourself, that sounds pretty easy to do. It seems as though any game that we're interested in is compact. That's what makes it interesting to us, that we're able to think about it. I'm not using an exponential amount of numbers in my head to think about a game. The catch is really number two. I need to be able to find an algorithm that uses this representation directly without kind of blowing it out internally in order to do the computation that I'm interested in doing. And finding representations that both succinctly represent games and are amenable to use by the sorts of algorithms that actually find fixed points of arbitrary utility functions has proven pretty difficult to do. So working with collaborators Naveen Bhatt and Albert Jiang, I've developed something called action graph games, which is a compact representation language for games. I'll give you a little bit of an intuition for how it works, but the goal is to be able to compactly write down and reason about large games that have some kind of sparse structure to them. And I'm able to reason about games that have a certain kind of independent structure to them, in which there's an anonymity property that says, I don't care the identities of the people I play with, but only the numbers of people who affect me in certain ways, or an additive structure. So any of these kinds of structures can be represented in an action graph game. This representation generalizes all of the previous compact representations that were known before, in the sense that it represents those games asymptotically equally compactly. And most importantly, we're able to show how essentially all of the game theoretic algorithms of interest can be extended to work on action graph games with unchanged complexity in the size of their input. Which means if an action graph game is exponentially smaller than a normal form game, then we directly achieve exponential speedups in using the algorithm. So this makes it practical to start thinking about some very much larger interactions, provided they have the kind of structure that can be represented as an AGG. Let me give you an example of that kind of structure. Here's a map of downtown Vancouver with a pin for the location of every coffee shop in Vancouver. And if you're a game theorist looking at something like this, you might be tempted to think of this as the equilibrium of the coffee shop location game. By which I mean, every one of these coffee shops had a choice about where to locate itself, and chose, first of all, that it was better to be in business than to leave the market, and secondly, that it was better to be wherever it is than it is to be somewhere else. And so in some sense, these coffee shops, I would claim, are more or less in balance with each other. I would be really interested in being able to build some kind of motivational description of what it takes to be a coffee shop, and to then be able to write that down as a game, find its equilibrium, and get an answer like this out as an equilibrium of that game. But notice how big this game is. I have one pin for every player in the game. So this is a very large number of players that I would have to reason about. And I have one action in the game for every place that you could put a pin. So I've got a lot of actions as well. So this is a really enormous game. And it's messy. It doesn't look like the kind of thing I could understand analytically. Now, I promised you in the abstract that all of my examples were, in all of the parts of the talk were in one sense or another going to touch on the internet. And although coffee shops do provide internet connections, that's a pretty tenuous link. So let me just sort of throw out an alternate variant of this game, which is the car-to-go location game. So here's the car-to-go map for Vancouver, sometime last night when cars were actually available in Vancouver. And those of you who actually use car-to-go might not be completely convinced by the following story, but imagine that car-to-go was trying to locate the cars in a way that would maximize their revenue as a company. Or if that's far-fetched to you, imagine that this is instead a taxi fleet, and each of the taxi drivers wants to go to a part of the city where they have the greatest chance of attracting business. Then this would look very much like the coffee shop location game with slightly different utility functions, where again, they would want to distribute themselves around in a way that concentrated in the high-value areas, but that respected the competition that they faced from each other. I'm going to stick with the coffee shop example from now on. So let's think about how we represent this as an action graph game. We start with a set of players, which is all of the individuals who might want to open a coffee shop. We're going to represent a graph. That's why this is called an action graph. And in particular, it's called an action graph because I'm going to have a node in the graph for every action the players could take. So all of the actions are all of the different locations where a coffee shop could be opened. And the utility that each player will get is the amount of profit they would get by being in that location. So this will depend in part on the inherent value of that location. It's better to be in the business district than it is to be in a residential area. But it will also depend on the number of other players who compete with the given player. So the more coffee shops who are in the same location as you are, the same city block, the more you're going to split business with them. And let's say if there are a lot of coffee shops one block away, they'll also affect your business, but not as much. So I'll represent that in the graph by making edges in the graph that say, for example, the utility of a player who chooses this node is affected by the number of people who choose this node, but also by the numbers who choose these adjacent nodes. That's just a modeling choice. I could have a different graph structure that would represent a different utility function here. But if I believe that the utility function looks something like this, in particular, if I believe that the utility of a coffee shop over here isn't affected by the distribution of coffee shops over there, then there's an independence property to my utility function, and that's what's captured by an action graph game. Well, for the most part, the way we make arguments about something like an action graph game is theoretically. So I would make a theorem statement that says something like, given a representation of a game, I can do a computation that I care about in time polynomial on the sides of the representation. This means that something that used to be exponential becomes instead polynomial. But if I really tried to walk you through all of this math, I think it would be boring for you, and you wouldn't really take away much more than I just said, which is why it's gray. So instead, I'm just going to show you something experimental, which is in a sense implied by the math that I just put up, but I think it's something you can sink your teeth into a little bit more. So here what I'm showing is coffee shop games on a 5x5 grid, comparing the representation size of the normal form, which is the matrix representation we saw before, with the action graph game representation. And here I'm looking at the number of payoffs I have to write down on a log scale, and the number of players on the x-axis. And you can see with the normal form, we shoot up into the ceiling. We didn't actually have enough hard drive space to represent the next data point, so I wasn't able to generate it. Whereas action graph games are scaling polynomially, and in particular, they're scaling sort of gently enough that we can represent pretty large games. We can go up to sort of hundreds of players, and we're still only kind of into megabytes. In terms of computation, now not looking at a log scale, so that you can sort of see in a little bit more detail what's going on here. This is the same different problems. I'm now doing a core computational problem, which is at the heart of most of the algorithms that we care about for doing computations on games. And again, you can see just a wildly big separation between what we can do with an AGG and what we can do in the normal form. So broadly speaking, and I should stress that this isn't an approximation. It's giving exactly the same numerical answer. It's just leveraging the structure of the game to do that more efficiently. So broadly speaking, what I want to leave you with in this part of the talk is just some sense of what a computer scientist might do in pure game theory, thinking computationally about kind of an inherent problem in game theory of finding an equilibrium and how we might be able to use that to reason about the world. Now, I'm going to switch now to talking about market design and analysis. I think I'll take questions at the end just because we've got a big group. So I'm going to switch to talking about market design and analysis, which is really I would claim one of the main application areas of game theory, and almost without a doubt the main application area of game theory within computer science. So auctions are kind of a language for thinking about markets that involve moderate numbers of participants. And auctions in particular are something that computer scientists have come to care quite a lot about. So I'd like to begin by telling you why that is, because it might seem to you that auctions are this sort of narrow, weird thing that it sort of explains how paintings get sold, but shouldn't really affect our life much as a computer scientist. So I argued right at the beginning of this talk that resource allocation is a core concern of computer scientists. And auctions are really fundamentally a language for thinking about resource allocation when the resource has to be allocated to one of several agents that has a selfish interest in that thing being allocated. And those of us who care about distributed systems are making decisions like that all the time. We're allocating scarce things among different people who value them. Whoops, you get that in a second. So I think that's kind of the abstract reason why we care. Of course, there's the more kind of practical reason why we care, which is just that auctions, big money changes hands in auctions, and the internet is becoming really important in the way auctions exist and are delivered. So here's a famous auction from 2004. This is an eBay auction, and here's what happened. A woman in Florida made herself a grilled cheese sandwich. She took a bite of it, and then she looked at it in amazement because she could see, as you can, that there's a perfect likeness of the face of the Virgin Mary on her grilled cheese sandwich. And so, as any spiritual person would do, she encased it in a case, sort of on cotton batting to keep it safe, and then she sold it on eBay. And this made the news, which is how I found out about it. It ended up selling for more than $10,000, and isn't that ridiculous? And in particular, doesn't this say something about the way auctions on the internet work? Not just that they're ridiculous, which sometimes they are, but that they really allow very, very thin markets to still operate. Thin in the sense that there probably are not many people in the world who would pay anything for somebody's partly eaten grilled cheese sandwich like this of the Virgin Mary or not. But also that certainly it would be pretty hard to find the person who values it the most and actually do a deal with them. You might worry that it would start to spoil, but she actually says in the description below the fold here that it was miraculously preserved. So I think this kind of goes to show the way that the internet has caused markets really to open up that didn't exist before, some of which are even important. So auctions really, though, are more than eBay. They're more than just kind of somebody standing wearing a funny hat and talking fast and then somebody just bought a painting. They're really a broad category of markets in which agents make binding declaration of interest in one or more things that are being allocated. These resources are then allocated according to rules that were committed to in advance, and money maybe changes hands. The overwhelming method for thinking about auctions is to analyze them using game theory. Now, we have to modify our game theoretic model a little bit to make this work. So we need to expand the action space so it's infinite, because people can bid any real value. And we have to accommodate the fact that you actually don't know the utility functions of the other players. It's somehow very important to an auction that I actually don't know what you're prepared to bid, which means I don't know what your utility function is. So we need to expand our definition a little bit, but this can be done pretty straightforwardly. There was only one Nobel Prize in that. And in the end, we do, in fact, think about them game theoretically. And it leads us to this yet another Nobel Prize topic of what's called mechanism design, which is, in a sense, inverse game theory. So the idea of mechanism design is, let's say I want to hold an auction. I want to allocate something scarce. And I've got some design freedom in the way I do that. I can change the rules of the auction. But I don't get to change the way you feel about the thing that I'm selling. That's kind of inherent to you. And so if I specify fully one way of selling it, then we end up with a game. We end up with a fully specified game that I can analyze using game theory. And I want to say, as I turn whatever design knob I've got, which game is best from my point of view, according to whatever objective function that I've got. Sort of recognizing the fact that for every setting of the knob, I've got a game theory problem. So this is the idea of mechanism design. And that's this section is all going to be about mechanism design. So here's an auction that is particularly important to think about, although it might initially seem strange. It's called a second price auction. And let's contrast it to something you might be more familiar with, which is called a first price auction. So in a second price auction, everyone submits a sealed bid. So everyone writes down on a piece of paper, I'll pay you $5 for the grilled cheese sandwich. The seller gets all of the pieces of paper, opens them up, and finds the highest one, and decides that's going to be the winner. Now, in a first price auction, that person would then pay the amount they wrote down on the piece of paper. And it's pretty clear that in a first price auction, sometimes it's called a silent auction, you would want to write down a number that was less than what the thing was actually worth to you, because that's how you would come out ahead. So you would want to think about how everyone else was going to bid, and you would sort of shade your bid to some extent. In a second price auction, the winner is going to pay the second highest of the numbers that were given to the auctioneer. So they're not going to pay anything to do with their own number. Their number gets used only to decide that they win. They then pay somebody else's number. And I want to claim to you that it's a dominant strategy. Remember dominant strategies. It's a dominant strategy in a second price auction to bid your true value for the good. And because it's a dominant strategy, that means you don't have to even think about what the other people do. Everybody else in the auction might be crazy. You still want to behave the same way. And I want to actually prove this to you, because it's kind of an elegant proof, and it's very simple. So first of all, I'll do a case analysis. I'll think about the case where you would be the high bidder if you bid truthfully, and the case where you wouldn't. So let's look at it here. So here you're the high bidder. This is the amount of your bid. This green line is your true value. And here's the next highest bid. And so this red line is the amount that you pay. And so I want to think through all the different things you could do in this setting. So here's what happens if you declare the truth. If you were to bid more than your true value, then you would still win, and you would still pay the same amount. So nothing would change for you. If you bid a bit less, then there would still be no difference until you bid enough less that you started to lose. And at that point, the other person would win, and you would be worse off. Because it used to be the case that you were paying one amount and getting something that was worth more than that to you. And now you instead are in a situation where you pay nothing and get nothing. And so that's not as good for you. The other case is that if you were to bid truthfully and weren't the high bidder in that case, I claim again you should tell the truth. So here, you're losing and paying nothing. If you bid less, you would continue to lose and pay nothing. If you bid a bit more, you would continue to lose and pay nothing until the point where you bid enough that you would win, but then you would pay too much. You'd pay an amount which is higher than your true value. And so this is really the whole story, right? Notice that I didn't assume anything in this analysis about how everybody else arrived at their bids. I just assumed that they bid in whatever way they did. And we saw that really there's no case where you can do better than telling the truth. So isn't the second price auction a thing of beauty? And in fact, there's a Nobel Prize for that too. But you might wonder then, how come you don't hear about this thing? How come it's such a funny sounding thing if it's got such great theory behind it? Well, one answer is that you have heard about it, you just haven't heard it called that. So second price auctions are actually hiding in plain sight all over the place. Here's an example. So eBay has something that they call automatic bidding. And the way it works is you place, so eBay is an ascending auction mechanism, but eBay says, look, we'll save you some time. Instead of you having to go in all the time and change your bid, just tell us a number that you're willing to bid up to, and we'll place bids up to that amount on your behalf, only as needed. We'll keep that number a secret, and we'll automatically place bids for you up to your number. Well, notice that if everyone did that, it would be a second price auction. It would be exactly a second price auction. Well, almost exactly. There's a bid increment that makes things a bit messy, but that's a constant. So effectively, eBay really has packaged up a second price auction in a way that makes it more intuitive to people. Now I want to talk about some work that I've actually been involved in the market design and analysis space. And I'm going to start by thinking about advertising options. So here's a Google search for Vancouver real estate. And I'm sure all of you have done searches like this and seen these ads that come up. Sometimes there are more ads that come up over here, but in this case there weren't any. So many of you probably know that these ads actually are the result of an auction. So if you click on, so these ads are being shown to you at no cost to the people who place the ads. But if you click on the ad, then money changes hands. So anytime you're feeling particularly happy about what a great product Google made for you, go in and click on some ads. That's called link fraud. And every time you click, somebody will pay something. And so how does this work? Well, the ranking of these different ads is descending by the product of a bid amount in an auction and something Google calls quality score. Now, quality score is essentially how frequently ads get clicked through. So Google wants to prefer ads that actually get clicked on, because after all, Google is selling impressions and paying for clicks, getting paid for clicks. And it also has some other stuff in it, which is sort of secret sauce about how much Google thinks the customer will like your ad once they click on it. But the important thing about quality score is that you have no control over it, or to the extent that you have control over it, it's something you're trying to improve anyway. It's sort of the quality of your page. So the bid amount is the thing you do control. And basically, people with higher bids show up higher in the list. So you're seeing people sorted by kind of quality score weighted bid. Every time you do a Google search, there's really an auction that happened in the moment when you did the search to decide the ranking. And here's what Google says to advertisers. The AdWords discounter will charge you the lowest cost per click you can be charged while still maintaining your position. That should sound to you a lot like a second price auction. That Google will charge you the amount that you would have had to bid in order to be in the position that you're in. So in other words, you're charged the amount of the position below you, not the amount that you bid yourself. Now, it's not quite a second price auction because there's this kind of cascading effect that each person is paying that amount for the person below them. There's not just one thing for sale here. We're selling a whole bunch of slots at once. But this is, in the literature, called a generalized second price auction. So let's look at how it works. I went into Google's advertising tool and told them that I wanted to advertise 4 different keywords: game theory, University of British Columbia, Vancouver real estate, and computer science.
Oh, you're not going to have to pay much.
Yeah, they vary, right? Well, and I told them that I wanted to redirect it to my homepage, which turns out not to be a very high quality thing, particularly for Vancouver real estate. Unfortunately, I think it's pretty good real estate, but what can I do? And so I told them that I was willing to pay a cost per click of up to $1. And Google says back to me, OK, you would get total clicks of 22 to 27. Here are the average positions that you would be listed in for these different topics. And here's the amount that you would end up spending per day in this ad campaign if you were to run it. And then I can start doing kind of a what-if analysis. I can say, all right, what if I was to instead be willing to pay $5 a click? And you can see my position starts going up. The amount that I have to pay starts going up. So I would pay kind of now hundreds of dollars. But I'm getting more clicks. I'm moving up this number of clicks curve that Google has given me here. And I'm paying more to do it. I'm paying a lot more to do it because I've got a really lousy site that I'm trying to advertise. So then I said, OK, well, what about $10 a click? And I go up a bit more. You can sort of keep an eye on the numbers. And I said, well, OK, $25 a click. I'm still not really getting that high, right? I'm still sort of 1.5. So I said, OK, $300 a click. $300 a click, I'm doing pretty well, right? I'm paying $3,000 a day to advertise my keywords, to get my 200 clicks. This clearly would not be a good move for me. But now the next thing is what I want to show you. So now I'm pretty much topped out, right? Now I'm pretty much at the beginning of all of, at the top of all of these lists. And so now I said, okay, tell you what, I'll pay you $10,000 a day per click. That would really be, I want to worry about link fraud a lot. And notice that actually nothing changes here, because Google's not going to charge me for the clicks, for the amount that I said I would pay per click. They're charging me kind of a second price. And because I'm at the top of the auction anyway, raising my bid didn't change anything here. I'm still essentially the same as I was before. Well, so something that's interesting about what's happened with ad auctions is that they've evolved over time. So it used to be that everyone used something called a generalized first price auction, which is kind of what you would think it is. Everyone just pays the amount of their bid. We sort people by bid amount, and people pay the amount of their bid. Then there was a movement to something called unweighted generalized second price, which basically means there was no quality score. Everyone just did a second price auction in prices. And then we moved to what we have today, which is called weighted generalized second price, which has this quality score element as well. And if you're the kind of person who likes thinking about mechanism design, there's something really interesting about this, because here we see a place where the practice actually got out ahead of the theory. We actually didn't, when these changes happened, actually have really any good theory about these different auction mechanisms that would help to explain why this happened. And you would like to think that tens of billions of dollars a year at stake in these auctions, so you'd like to think that this transition happened for good reasons. And in particular, that WGSP is somehow better than GFP or UGSP. And so you might ask, well, in what sense would you like to argue that it's better? You might argue that it's better in terms of revenue, in the sense that you charge people more for the same amount in equilibrium, so it's better for you as an auctioneer to have changed the rules. Or you might argue that it's better in terms of efficiency, which means the people who actually want higher slots more end up getting them more often. So you're doing a better job of ranking people in order of how much they actually want the different slots. So the approach that I and my student David Thompson have been thinking about is something that we call computational mechanism analysis. And the idea is to ask what happens in equilibrium of real-world mechanisms under given valuation distributions that describe the way bidders really work. The hope is to be able to answer quantitative questions that are difficult to attack theoretically, and to be able to operate even in pretty messy domains where we relax assumptions that we need to make if we want to do a theoretical analysis. And the way this works is we get some valuation distribution that describes the way bidders feel. We repeatedly sample games from this distribution. We represent them as action graph games. We solve them using our general action graph game solvers. And then looking at these many different solutions that we get, we end up with the ability to make statistical claims about one thing is significantly better than another thing, or so on. So that's what we did here in order to try to think about these different ad auction mechanisms and why it is that this change can be explained. So the first thing we looked at is efficiency. And what you see here in terms of efficiency is 4 different valuation distributions that have been proposed in the literature. Don't worry about what they are. And the amount of efficiency that we get for each of these different mechanisms in equilibrium as a fraction of the total amount of efficiency that it would be possible to get. There's an error bar on every one of these bar plots. So this is the worst equilibrium we ever saw, and this is the best one. If you don't see an error bar, that's because it's very small. And we did statistical tests as well. So looking only at the best and the worst range here, you can't really infer significance. But we did test significance. And we found that in every one of these cases, there was a progression towards more efficiency that was significant as this transitions from one mechanism to the other was made. So it looks like this argument that things get better for the bidders in terms of which ranking actually gets produced in equilibrium is borne out by this analysis. The other thing we might wonder about is revenue. Here I'm looking just at one of those 4 distributions, so I can show you the shape of 3 distributions of revenue. And essentially what we found is that there isn't a significant difference in revenue between the equilibria of the 3 different mechanisms. So you might think that Google is trying to optimize their revenue, but it seems to us that they're not trying to optimize it, at least in the short term. Now you might argue that efficiency is a good proxy for long-term revenue, because if the market does good things for the bidders, more bidders will participate, they'll spend more money in the market, and this might be better for Google overall. So it might be more in Google's interest to make a market that people like to use than to try to squeeze a little bit more money out of them in one interaction. You might wonder if I'm saying this is not significant just because I haven't actually got enough data and that it would turn out to be significant. But actually, if we drill in and compare a couple of things now game by game, you can see what's really happening is just that there's a huge variance here. It depends a lot game by game. So sometimes one mechanism is wildly better than another in terms of revenue, and sometimes it's the opposite. So it really seems to us as though revenue is not the story here. So again, I tell you all of that mostly in a desire just to tell you something about how we might do the computational analysis of mechanisms. Now I want to switch to telling you about what I did on my summer vacation, or more specifically on my sabbatical in 2011 when I spent 4 months in Uganda. Here's a picture of what a vegetable market looked like in Africa a bit more than 100 years ago. And here's a picture of what vegetable markets in Uganda look like now. They're not substantially different. Essentially, farmers take their stuff to the side of the road and wait for people to come and sell it. Now, sometimes the scale of these markets can be bigger. This is the Kalewe market in downtown Uganda, which is downtown Kampala, which is the capital city. This is one of the largest vegetable markets in the country. But still, the sort of general principle is the same, that these guys kind of went around by the side of the road, bought a bunch of plantains, brought them in, and everyone's coming in to buy them. And here's the whole market kind of seen from above. So really, everyone just brings their tarp and lays out all this stuff, and people go in and buy it. Now, that's sort of charming. It's a colorful picture to look at. But the problem is that this market is really inefficient. Subsistence agriculture is by far the biggest segment of the economy in Uganda by number of people involved. Something like 80% of Ugandans engage in subsistence agriculture. And so selling a little bit of surplus agriculture when they've got it is a really important source of money. And farmers waste a lot of time hauling around their produce, waiting by the side of the road, hoping that somebody will come and buy what they've got. And sellers, because everything is so sporadic, sellers have a hard time finding the buyers too, finding out who's got good produce at a particular time. And one way of seeing this is that in the urban centers, even in kind of the rich neighborhood of Kampala where I lived, you would go to the market one day and there'd be no tomatoes. And it wasn't because all of a sudden there had been a great tomato famine across all of Uganda. 20 miles north, somebody would be sitting there with a bucket of tomatoes. They just wouldn't have made it to my market. If you want to be a little bit more rigorous and less anecdotal about it, you can look for arbitrage opportunities as a way of seeing that the market isn't working. So we, along with a student at Makerere University where I was, we did an analysis of historical data to see if we could find persistent arbitrage opportunities. And what that means is if we could find one city where I can buy a staple crop at the prevailing price in that city at that time, rent a truck, put the crop in the truck, pay somebody the cost of hauling it somewhere else and the fuel cost of doing that, and then sell it at the prevailing price in another place and make a profit. And you can see that our analysis showed that even with pretty conservative assumptions about what everything costs to do, we could make kind of between 10 and 30% profits on different staple crops in really reliable ways by moving them around. I actually told somebody about this analysis at a party, a Ugandan friend of a friend, and his face went ashen. He was really worried. And it turned out this was his whole business, was just arbitraging around crops. And he thought I'd figured out his secret, which I had. Actually, from an economic point of view, he was doing a good thing, right? He was arbitraging away this difference. The problem was he didn't have enough capital to actually move the prices entirely. So I just wish there were more people like him. But I want to argue that this might be the wave of the future. So this is a picture taken by a collaborator of mine. This is a Ugandan farmer in his field with his mobile phone. So this is, it's actually quite amazing. Something like 40% of Ugandans have mobile phones, whereas only about 25% of Ugandans have electricity. So mobile phone penetration is really enormous. You're wondering, how do they charge their mobile phones? There are little stands for that, actually. You can pay somebody $1 to charge your phone. But these phones are pretty low end. So the service is good, the penetration is high, but people have got really like the Nokia phone you had 10 years ago. And so they don't have an iPhone, they don't have the ability to go surfing the internet, but they have the ability to send SMS. And so with my collaborators at Makerere, we tried to build a market for agricultural commodities that would allow people to place simple bids that would say, here's what I've got, or here's what I want, and that we could match people up and propose trades to them and have it all happen over SMS. And the real limitation of SMS is there can be no browsing, because we have to pay for every SMS message that happens. To make this thing feasible, we've got to take the cost of the SMS messages, which is a bit more than 2 cents a message. So it's not much on the scale of an aid project, but it adds up if people are browsing like crazy. So we have to keep it kind of reasonable. So we've in fact built such a market. There's a reputation engine built into this, which is important to have. The way it works is that you can ban specific traders if they've done you wrong in the past or if you hear bad things about them. It's costly to you to ban somebody because the system will never match you with that person, but it gives everybody else information about that person being untrustworthy. So the prototype is up and running. It's called Kudu. Here's the web page of the system, showing, among other things, our recent stats on the amount of different staple products being offered and bought in the system. So here's some ways of slicing it. Here's the number of registered users that we've got. At about the new year, we were pretty close to 0. And we've now grown up to about 500 users, which is a big deal because a market like this is attractive to buyers the more sellers there are, and attractive to sellers the more buyers there are. So really, getting over the initial hurdle is the hardest part. And I'm pretty encouraged. We've been doing radio advertisements, going out and meeting with particular big-scale traders and so on, and managing to get these numbers up. Much credit to Richard, in particular, the student leading this project. Another way of thinking about it is in terms of money. So as of a couple of days ago, Kudu users have offered about $500,000 US in produce for sale and about $100,000 US in produce to buy. Of course, as you might imagine, a US dollar buys rather a lot of food in Uganda. So these are particularly large amounts of money in Uganda. And this is pretty encouraging. You can see it's a seller's market, a buyer's market at the moment, in the sense that you're much better off being a buyer. There are a lot of people who want to sell to you. This represents the relatively disadvantaged position that farmers have. But I still think overall this is pretty encouraging. OK, the last market design thing I want to briefly tell you about is spectrum repacking. So the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, recently, this is a New York Times article from September 28th of last year, recently decided to do a big thing in order to make available more spectrum for high-speed wireless. The way they want to do this is take broadcast television stations and have them sell their rights to broadcast, go off the air, because most people get their TV from cable, and then repack all of the spectrum into a smaller amount of spectrum, and then take what they've cleared and sell it to cell phone companies so that there can be more spectrum available for things like your iPhone. So this is a really complicated auction design problem. There's going to be an ascending price auction for telecoms, where the cost of having a license in a particular place will go up over time until supply and demand meet. And there'll be simultaneously a reverse auction for the broadcasters, where they declare they're willing to stop broadcasting at a high rate, and then the price gets lowered and lowered as long as it remains still possible for them to be repacked into the amount of spectrum that exists. And the thing that I'm interested in is this repacking. The question of, can I take all of these different television stations and figure out a way of remapping them onto different channels that will still work, given the interference constraints between different channels? And these interference constraints are really complicated. They're actual physical constraints that have to do with the way that radio signals propagate, where the hills are, where the population density is. And the better this repacking can be done, the more the auction can go, the more the prices in the reverse auction can go down, and the less money the government is going to have to spend to achieve the same thing. So I've been working on this feasibility testing problem along with my student Alex Frechette. And so we've been thinking about this problem of asking whether a given repacking can be done given the interference constraints. And this is a hard graph coloring problem. This is actually the constraint graph of the real problem for the whole national US. So every one of these nodes in the graph is a station, and there's an edge between two stations if they interfere with each other. This is the eastern seaboard, more or less, where the population density is the greatest. And the FCC believed that this simply couldn't be done at a national scale, and so they were looking at all kinds of relaxations to the problem, which would work in the auction, but which would lead them to paying a lot more because they would give up on being able to push the repacking further along. So Alex and I have been attacking this problem using tools from empirical algorithmics and leveraging some of what Holger Huss and I have developed over the last decade in the empirical algorithmics group that we work on together. And in particular, we've been exploiting a SAT encoding of the problem. And we've then been leveraging automatic algorithm configuration tools that were developed particularly by Holger and Frank Hutter, and also by Steve Ramage, who has joined us more recently. So we've been leveraging this automatic algorithm configuration tool to try to make this thing work well in practice. The real advantage we have is that this graph is never going to change. It's always going to be the same graph of the United States. So we want an algorithm that does well on this graph, or on subsets of this graph. And so here's what we found. So the first thing here's sort of the best thing we were able to do without kind of any messing around. This is an algorithm called picosat. It's a SAT solver. Here I'm showing you on the x-axis the amount of time that elapsed on a log scale. So here's a second, a minute, and 30 minutes, which is the amount of time the FCC will give us. And here's the fraction of instances we can solve in that amount of time. So you can see that within 30 minutes, at a national scale, we can solve 95% of the problems. That is already pretty amazing. Here's some different ways of slicing the numbers. So here's this as a histogram if you don't like CDFs, which you should. And here's showing you what we actually found. So blue says, yes, it was possible to repack. Red says, no, it wasn't possible. And gray says, we ran out of time and we had to give up. And that's essentially where we're leaving money on the table, because we might have been that might have been blue. So the FCC is basically interested in us getting rid of the gray. Here's a different SAT solver called CLASP. And you can see that it's stochastically dominated by the first one. For any given time budget, I'm doing better with the red one than with the blue one. But now here's what's interesting. We took the automatic configuration tool and we ran it on CLASP, which seemed weaker but has the advantage of having a lot of exposed parameters. And you can see that it now does significantly better than picosat given long time budgets. And in particular, it gets that gray region really, really low. So this is kind of our current state of the art. We're still really actively working on this. But I think that this method has the opportunity to really make an impact in practice. So the last thing I'd like to tell you about is behavioral game theory. And what I mean by this is thinking about how game theory can be extended to think about how people really behave in the world. So one objection that people often have to game theory is to say, it's really beautiful, but people just don't act that way. People aren't as rational as game theory wants to say that they are. So now you might think, well, game theory is a good way of thinking about the way firms behave or the way people behave when the stakes are high. There's certainly ways of kind of arguing in favor of game theory, but sometimes you might want to say, okay, sometimes we just do want to think about how people behave, and game theory might not be quite the right tool for that. On the other hand, it turns out people are pretty reliable in what they do. People are predictable even though they're not quite doing what game theory says. I should say, incidentally, so there are these experimental economists. They're economists who actually get people together in a lab and do the really tricky work of paying people to do experiments, making sure that the payments are set up in such a way that they correspond appropriately to utilities. And you're really measuring what you think you're measuring, and you find out, does game theory describe what they're doing or not? And what they found is, sometimes it really does describe what people are doing. It's really actually a pretty good description. But then sometimes there are ways you can change the payoffs in a game in a way that don't change the game theoretic predictions at all, but wildly change people's behavior. And so clearly the game theoretic story, while it's useful, is not the whole story. And so behavioral game theory aims to say, all right, we'll bite the bullet. Let's build models that just describe what people do. Let's not worry about these things being beautiful. Let's worry about them being right. And oddly enough, it turns out that the literature in behavioral game theory has conducted many experiments. It's proposed many models based on clever ideas. And it hasn't really, in the end, delivered much of a recommendation on what model you should actually use. They've pretty much kind of stopped, for the most part, at the proposing of models phase, with some exceptions, but fewer than you would expect. So along with my student, James Wright, and kind of later on with a collaborator, Colin Kammerer, we did the first large-scale comparison of these kinds of models, proposed some new analysis techniques, and eventually proposed some new models that work better for predicting how people behave in simultaneous move games. So let me tell you just a little bit about that. So first of all, I want to tell you two ideas from behavioral game theory about how people would behave when they play an unrepeated simultaneous move game. And let me say as an aside, I don't want to claim those are the only important games to think about. I rather prefer to claim that they're important, and that if we can't get that right, we've got no hope on more complicated games, and so we should start with something simple. So on such games, one important idea is the idea of a quantal response. And what we say is, remember best response from before. A best response says, if I give you 3 options that are worth different amounts, you're just going to pick the one that is worth the most. You're not going to care about the fact that this other one is worth almost equally much. You're just going to do the best thing for you. And game theory is pretty substantially built on the idea that people would play best responses. Quantal response says you're going to kind of randomize over all of the different things that you might do. And you're going to randomize in proportion to how good things are for you, or in proportion to something like an exponential of how good things are for you. So 2 things that are very similar in terms of their payoff are both going to be played with high probability. Something with a substantially lower payoff for you is still going to be played, but it's going to be played really vanishingly little compared to the other alternatives for you. So this is the idea of quantally responding. The other really influential idea from behavioral game theory is the idea of iterative strategic reasoning. And here we say there are different levels of agents in the world. So a level 0 agent is what we're going to call somebody who just doesn't think about what other people will do. They just go into the game, they act like it's not a game. They act like it's just a situation where they're the only one out there. We all know people like that. And so to make things simple for the moment, let's say, as most of the literature does, that they just uniformly randomize over all of the different options that are available to them. Well, then a level 1 agent is basically an agent that believes that everybody else is level 0. So a level 1 agent thinks they're pretty clever because they're going to get the jump on the level 0 agents. So they say, I know how a level 0 agent would behave. I've got a little model in there, which is actually correct. And I'm then going to respond to that. And then, of course, you can have a level 2 agent, which is somebody who thinks that everyone else is level 1. Or depending on which model of behavioral game theory you subscribe to, they might think everyone else is both level 1 and level 0. Or they could be either. So this turns out to be kind of useful. In particular, it kind of captures the idea that it seems that most of us do this kind of reasoning, but we don't do it very deep. It turns out that game theory effectively claims that people do arbitrarily much strategic reasoning about other people. That I think about what you think about what I think about what you think about what I think about what you think. And maybe we do that once or twice, but it seems unlikely that we do that 10 or 15 times deep. So this tries to capture that idea that we do it, but we just do it a bit. Well, at a very high level, let me tell you some key findings of what James and I have turned up in 3 different papers on this work. So the first is in comparing these different models to each other, and this is sort of a schematic that you can't see that tells you that we did that. We looked at models that involved only the first of those ingredients, the quantal response, only the second, different variations of this iterative strategic reasoning, or both. Iterative strategic reasoning where you're quantally responding to the next level down. Ironically enough, it turns out that the third thing, where you're doing both, was actually the model that was proposed earliest in the literature by almost a decade. And nevertheless, it turns out that that model is best. And so we found that kind of surprising because indeed the fashion in the literature had been to move towards these somewhat simpler models that only captured one of these phenomena. We found they were both useful, but really combining them together was more useful yet. We then got interested in trying to think about what we can actually conclude from the parameters of these models, what they tell us about human behavior. And this required us to turn to different analysis techniques where we actually estimate the whole posterior distribution over parameters in order to be able to say things like, what fraction of level 0 people might we think there are in the population, that sort of thing. And we found that, in fact, many of these parameters were taking on pretty counterintuitive values. And by reasoning about what was going on, we were able to actually come up with simpler variants of these models that perform better, despite being simpler. So that was kind of the upshot of this parameter analysis work. And finally, we have some recent work, which is currently under review. Don't tell anyone that you heard about this, where we're trying to model the idea of salience. So we went back to the idea of level 0 people, and we said, well, level 0 is really always supposed to be people who don't think strategically about other people. But that doesn't mean they have to be uniform randomizers. It just means they can't be thinking iteratively about other people's actions. So maybe they're thinking a little bit more cleverly about what they do in the level 0 phase. Maybe they're thinking about which outcomes could lead them to the best payoff. So which outcomes would be best in the worst case. Or which outcomes have the biggest numbers in them, or which outcome was presented to them first, or those sorts of things. So we built models that allowed for all of these different sorts of things to happen in the level 0 model. Of course, that also changes the upper level models because it means the level 1 people are now reasoning about a different kind of level 0 person. And on the whole, it made a really phenomenal difference in performance. So it turned out that this yielded really, really dramatic improvements to the quality of the model. I think now this means that our models are really dramatically better than anything else that I know of in the literature. So with that, let me just wrap up. So I've been telling you about this area of algorithmic game theory, the work that I've done in this area in particular, and claiming that it helps us to reason about an interconnected world. I hope you have a bit of a sense of what I would have meant by that now. I talked about reasoning about large games, about how we can compute equilibria, other game theoretic quantities of interest in a large game interaction using this action graph game representation. I told you about market design and analysis, why it's important to computer scientists, how we can essentially do non-cooperative protocol design between agents. And I spoke about 3 applications, understanding what's been going on in advertising auctions, Kudu, our SMS-based market for agricultural commodities in Uganda, and this problem of repacking spectrum in the FCC's upcoming radio spectrum redistribution problem, which really puts computational issues at the center of the problem. Finally, I talked a bit about behavioral game theory and how we've been making progress on predicting how people behave. So let me just end by thanking my collaborators who have been involved in all of these different projects and putting their pictures up here. And I'll take your questions. Thanks for your attention.
Questions?
So I think it's only fair that Lax go first because he actually raised his hand in the middle of the talk.
It was going to be a technical question which would have made sense at the time. Basically, I was curious what class of games you were able to come up with compact representations for using this action graph notion.
It's a little difficult to say in the sense that there really isn't a description, an answer to that question which is more succinct than the definition of what an action graph game is. I mean, the most succinct thing I can say is that if your utility function exhibits context-specific independence, additivity, or anonymity, then it works. So what do those things mean? Context-specific independence means there exist pairs of sets of things that you and I could do, where if I take something from the first set and you take something from the second set, you and I don't care which elements from the set we each took. So we're independent of each other, subject to the context of having chosen from those 2 sets. So that's a sort of a weak independence property. Anonymity means I don't care exactly who opens up coffee shops around me, I just care how many there are. And additivity means that my utility function can be decomposed into the sum of smaller things. So essentially, if any or all of those things are true, then action graph games work for you. I answered your question too, right?
No.
I see. Yeah.
Great talk. I was just wondering, like, in the last 10 years, transparency has kind of taken over in a lot of different fields, like the coffee shop thing. Like now it's very easy to find out where all the coffee shops are at a very low cost. Has that kind of changed game theory at all? Like have people been looking at how there's so much transparency in markets now? Like people are behaving differently?
Well, I mean, I think in a sense, one way to answer your question is that it may actually make the game theoretic prediction more reasonable. Because game theory has always kind of said that people solve optimization problems perfectly by themselves. And all of these tools are really tools to help you solve an optimization problem better. And so you start looking more and more like the rational actor that game theory wants to say that you are. You can find the best coffee shop by whatever desiderata you have, location, niche, whatever. And so game theory would always have kind of said, you're going to do the thing that's best for your utility. I think the other thing that isn't exactly what you asked about, but maybe is worth saying, is that these kinds of tools also encourage us to make things more complicated. They encourage us now in markets to allow people to express more complex preferences than they could before. We now say, well, actually, cell phone companies value sets of things in complicated ways, so maybe we should sell all of these things all in the same auction and let people express their preferences over sets. Or, in my supply chain problem, I actually care about how, one thing that I win might affect a different thing. It's an input to a different process, and I should be able to talk about that. So I think a lot of that complexity is pushing into markets. And I think that's another key reason why computer scientists are getting involved, because computer science really is the study of managing complexity. Yeah?
For the spectrum repacking issue, is the constraint that parts of the spectrum that interfere with each other can't be sold together to the same subload company?
Not quite. The constraint is all of the television stations are fixed, so they're all broadcasting from some tower somewhere. And essentially it's the case that if you're in your tower over there and I'm in my tower over here, we're too close to each other to be broadcasting on the same frequency, because we would interfere on too much of the population that lies between us. And maybe we're actually so close to each other that we can't even be one channel apart from each other, which means that this is why it's a variation of a graph coloring problem, because there's actually an ordering on the colors, and we can't even be on nearby colors. But if we're sufficiently far apart from each other, we interfere only a little bit, and then it's OK. And so I have to kind of think about assigning all of these different frequencies in a way that keeps all of the interference at sensible low levels.
Any other questions?
What percentage of economics students are already familiar with computer science and in the next 10 years?
I think this is, you're inviting me to engage in biased sampling, because the economic students that I know are the ones who know something about computer science. Right? There's presumably an army of economic students out there that don't talk to me and that therefore are less likely to know about computer science. And my sense is that it's still not that huge a number. I think it's growing. I think this area has been more lively on the computer science side than on the economic side for reasons that I think are mostly cultural. Because I think computer science is a discipline that really understands itself to be very interdisciplinary, and we plug into biology and psychology and electrical engineering and kind of you name it. I think economics doesn't quite understand itself in that same way, and I think it's been a little bit more concerned with doing things that are of importance to its own field rather than doing things that can reach out into and be important to other fields. That being said, I think every year there are more economists getting excited about this kind of stuff, and clearly, I think as there are successes like what's been going on with the FCC, and not just in this auction, but in previous FCC auctions, certainly it's attracting interest by economists. Yeah, Bill.
Have you had any thoughts about adding repeated games here, now that you've done some of the simple stuff for behavioral game theory, in the sense that repeated games, and a lot of what people do are play repeated games where if you burn me once, I might change my strategy, right? And just curious if you...
Absolutely. That's something James and I have been indeed really talking about doing. James will be encouraged. Actually, James just left, so he would have been encouraged to hear you say that. People will now tell him, and he'll be encouraged sometime later. But yeah, I think that's a particularly worthwhile thing to do. The reason that I was really slow to do it is we know from behavioral studies, from things like prospect theory, a lot of these paradoxes that arise in human behavior really have to do with time. So there are senses in which you discount differently at different times. Like you get anchoring effects where there's something, once you have something, you want it more than you wanted it before you had it. And kind of capturing all of these kind of endowment effects and framing and everything, I think is going to be very complex. So I think we wanted to get these initial conditions right before we went into that part of the space.
I think we're coming off there. So I want to thank Kevin for a great talk, combining theory and experiment, showing computational applications of game theory, and showing not a common computer science talk when you hear how to get rich and how to save the farmers in Uganda in the same time. So, thanks very much.
Thank you.